Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're digging into a source you sent our way. It's a transcript from a YouTube interview. Michael Knowles interviewing Dr. Andy Wakefield.
Right.
And this chat, it really dives headfirst into some pretty complex stuff. We're talking Dr. Wakefield's research, the whole MMR vaccine controversy, and just broader vaccine safety questions.
There's definitely a lot to unpack.
Yeah, so our mission here is to get a solid handle on the key claims, the arguments, the controversies, the different viewpoints in this specific interview. We'll focus quite a bit on Dr. Wakefield's side of the story, his experiences.
Now, we know you're looking for a way to get up to speed on this quickly but properly, understand the perspectives without feeling totally overwhelmed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So briefly, the people involved. Michael Knowles is the interviewer, and the guest, Dr. Andy Wakefield, he's the main author of that 1998 Lancet study, the one that kicked off a lot of the concern about MMR and autism.
And subsequently faced a huge amount of criticism, lost his license. A very controversial figure.
Absolutely. So let's get into it. The interview kicks off with Wakefield talking about the mid-90s. He was doing research on inflammatory bowel disease back then.
Right, that was his field.
But then he starts getting these calls from parents. What were they telling him?
Yeah, this is where it starts. He describes getting calls, and the stories were strikingly similar. Parents, he describes them as articulate, thoughtful people saying their kids were developing normally.
Okay.
And then, pretty soon after getting the MMR shot, they saw this sudden regression. Kids losing speech they already had, language skills, social interaction just disappearing.
Wow. And they also mentioned other things. Sleep problems.
Sleep disturbances, yeah, lots of screaming, signs of pain. It sounded really distressing.
And wasn't there that phrase they kept using, something about their eyes?
That's the one. The lights went out in their eyes. He mentions it multiple times in the interview. It's a really powerful emotional description.
It really is. And these parents, they were also seeing gut problems in their kids.
Yes, gastrointestinal issues. And crucially, they felt their doctors were often dismissive, saying things like, oh, that's just part of the autism.
Brushing it off?
Kind of, yeah. But the parents, they were seeing this pattern. Normal kid, MMR vaccine, then regression and gut problems. Some started thinking, is this some kind of epidemic?
So Wakefield hears this. What was his reaction? Because autism wasn't seen as linked to gut issues back then.
Exactly. He says he was surprised. Autism, when he trained, was considered pretty rare, maybe 1 in 2,500 back in the 60s.
Right.
Now, of course, the numbers are cited as much higher, around 1 in 36 currently.
Yeah.
And it wasn't typically associated with bowel disease, so these reports were unusual.
So he's hearing these consistent, unusual stories. What does he do?
Well, he emphasizes something he calls a fundamental rule of clinical medicine. You have to listen to the parents, especially the mothers, he says.
Okay.
He felt you had to put aside your own ideas and just listen to their accounts. He saw a pattern and started wondering, could there be some kind of gut inflammation affecting the brain?
Like a gut-brain connection.
Sort of, yeah. He mentions conditions like celiac disease as an example where gut problems can have wider effects. So he took these parental concerns seriously.
And that directly led to the research, and eventually that famous 1998 Lancet paper. How did that actually come together?
So, based on these parent reports, he put together a team. Included Professor John Walker-Smith, a top pediatric gastroenterologist, plus psychiatrists, neurologists.
A multidisciplinary team.
Right. And he stresses that they initially investigated the children based on their clinical needs. It wasn't strictly set up as formal research right away, more like these kids are sick, let's figure out what's wrong.
And what did they find clinically?
Through things like scopes, biopsies, they found inflammation in the kids' bowels, actual physical evidence of gut problems.
Okay, so confirming the parents' observations on that front.
Yes. And the parents had also mentioned that dietary changes like removing gluten and cow's milk seemed to help.
Ah, right. Did the research look into that?
Wakefield says their clinical findings supported that too. Anti-inflammatory treatments and these dietary changes did seem to lead to improvements, not just in the gut symptoms, but sometimes in the behavioral autistic symptoms as well.
So all of this gets compiled into the 1998 Lancet case series. But the conclusion, that's where things get really contentious. What did the paper actually conclude?
This is super important, and Wakefield hammers this point home in the interview. The paper reported the parental accounts, the referring doctor's notes, their own clinical findings of bowel disease, and the developmental regression. But the final line, the conclusion, explicitly stated, and he quotes it, "This study does not prove an association, let alone a causal association with the MMR vaccine."
So it did not say MMR causes autism.
Absolutely not. He insists the paper was just reporting a potential link, a novel bowel disease found in these children with regression, and it called for more research. That's it.
Yet the public perception, the accusation, was that he did claim causation.
Precisely. He highlights that massive gap between what the study said and how it was portrayed, leading to widespread fear and eventually issues around the paper itself.
Which brings us straight to the retraction. The common story is the paper was retracted for fraud by everyone involved. What's Wakefield's take?
He strongly disputes that narrative. He says it's a media-driven myth that all authors retracted the study due to fraud.
Okay, so what does he say happened?
His version is that 9 of his co-authors were pressured, or persuaded, as he puts it, to retract an interpretation of the study. The interpretation being that MMR causes autism.
An interpretation the paper itself didn't make.
Exactly. He says since the paper never made that causal claim, he and 2 other senior colleagues, including Professor Walker-Smith, refused to retract that interpretation. They stood by the actual paper.
And he clarifies the retraction wasn't about the finding of bowel disease or the timing.
Correct. He says the retraction didn't nullify the findings about the gut inflammation, the link in time to MMR reported by parents, the regression, or the kids' diagnoses. Just that controversial, unstated interpretation.
Okay. Now, another major attack on him involved conflict of interest allegations. What were those about?
The main accusation was that he was secretly working on his own single measles vaccine and was trying to trash MMR to make way for his product, basically to make a fortune.
And his response?
He acknowledges he was involved in a separate study. He says it was related to potential legal cases, looking for bits of measles viral remnants in the tissues of affected children. Finding that could suggest a link.
Which sounds like it could be a conflict.
Well, his counter is that he was completely open about it.
Yeah.
He says he disclosed this work before the Lancet paper ever came out. Told the medical school dean, officials, his boss, Professor Roy Pounder.
Even the press.
Yes, he says he even told national newspapers about it beforehand. And Richard Horton, the editor at the Lancet, apparently knew about it a year before publication, too.
So he's arguing transparency, not a cover-up.
That's his position, total transparency. He also mentioned something he calls lawfare being used against him.
The lawfare.
Basically, using costly legal battles to silence or bankrupt critics. He claims this made it financially impossible for him to sue for defamation over these conflict of interest claims.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. A listener specifically asked about the single vaccines, measles, mumps, rubella given separately. Why aren't they easily available? What's Wakefield's perspective on this?
He talks about looking into the original safety studies for the combined MMR vaccine before it was licensed.
And what did he find? Or claims he found?
He claims those studies were, well, inadequate, done on small groups, sometimes involving vulnerable populations like kids in institutions, not the kind of large, rigorous FDA-style controlled trials you might expect.
So ethical questions there and questions about whether results from those groups apply to healthy kids?
Right. And a key point for him. He says there was a lack of specific safety testing on the combination of the 3 live viruses together in one shot.
He thought the combination itself might pose different risks.
He raises that possibility. Suggests potential interference, like maybe the mumps component could weaken the immune response to the measles component.
So his recommendation was?
Based on these concerns, he felt offering the single vaccine separately was a safer, more cautious approach. Give parents that choice.
But that choice largely disappeared, didn't it?
That's what he describes. He says the UK government stopped the import license for single measles vaccines. In the US, Merck just decided to stop making and selling the single versions, effectively removed the option.
Why? Did he get any explanation?
He recounts asking a UK health official and being told, basically, that they had to get rid of the single vaccines to protect the MMR program.
Protect the program, not necessarily based on direct safety comparison data for the combined versus single.
He suggests that was the rationale given. He also mentions another official saying they just assumed the combined MMR would be as safe as the single measles shot, even without specific comparative studies on the combined formula.
Wow. Okay. So Wakefield is raising these safety questions, suggesting alternatives. Did he face pushback for doing this research?
Oh, absolutely. He speaks about serious threats to his career if he kept going down the vaccine safety path.
Really? Direct threats?
That's what he alleges, yeah. He also felt his pediatric colleagues were hesitant to question MMR safety publicly, fearing damage to their own reputations. He even claims his research work at the Royal Free Hospital was deliberately sabotaged.
Despite this, he took his concerns to the CDC, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control.
Yes, he mentions a presentation to the CDC back in 2001. He says they acknowledge that, okay, not every child who gets the vaccine develops autism.
Right.
So he suggested why not look at exposure patterns, specifically the timing of the MMR shot. Maybe younger kids, like those getting it right on schedule at 12, 15 months, were more vulnerable than kids who got it later.
And did the CDC follow up on that idea?
According to Wakefield, yes. He claims the CDC did conduct a study looking at exactly the timing. And he alleges that study found a significantly higher risk of autism for kids, particularly African-American boys who got the MMR on time compared to those who got it later.
A higher risk found by the CDC itself? That sounds huge.
It is, and this leads directly into the whole CDC whistleblower story with Dr. William Thompson.
Okay, explain that connection.
So Wakefield alleges that the CDC took that study showing the increased risk related to timing and buried it for 14 years.
Buried it. How?
He claims there were documents destroyed, data manipulated, all to hide this finding. And then years later, Dr. William Thompson, who was a senior scientist and author on that very CDC study, apparently contacted another researcher, Dr. Brian Hooker. And Thompson, according to Wakefield, confessed. Said something like, "I have to tell you, we did a terrible thing." He supposedly gave Hooker original documents and data showing the alleged fraud, proving the CDC covered up the link.
So for Wakefield, this wasn't just about his own 1998 paper anymore.
No, he says this alleged cover-up by the CDC was actually what fully convinced him of the link between MMR and autism. Not just his initial observations, but this apparent institutional deception.
He even claims Thompson said something about Wakefield's own situation.
Yeah, he recounts Thompson reportedly saying that if the CDC had just been honest about their findings back then, Wakefield's career might have been saved.
This whole whistleblower saga was central to the movie Vaxxed, right?
Exactly. Wakefield discusses the film, explaining it presented Thompson's recording confessions, the documents, essentially laying out the case for CDC fraud publicly.
And what was the CDC's response to the film?
Well, Wakefield points out what didn't happen. He says the CDC never sued the filmmakers for defamation, despite these incredibly serious accusations. He presents this lack of legal action as sort of tacit admission that the film's claims were true.
And Congress didn't investigate.
He mentions calls for a congressional inquiry, but says it never happened.
Meanwhile, Wakefield himself lost his medical license. What were the specific grounds for that, and what's his defense?
The official charges revolved around conducting unethical research, performing invasive procedures like colonoscopies and lumbar punctures on developmentally challenged children without proper approval from an ethics committee.
And his counter-argument.
He maintains, along with Professor Walker-Smith, that these procedures were done for clinical reasons, to diagnose and help the children who are clearly suffering, not purely for research purposes.
He draws a comparison, doesn't he?
Yeah, he points out what he sees as hypocrisy. He contrasts the vaccine safety studies authorities conducted on vulnerable institutionalized children with the criticism he faced for investigating sick children under his care.
He sounds quite definitive about the process against him.
He does. He mentions his own lawyer being confident they'd win based on the evidence, but then the General Medical Council found him guilty on all charges. He believes the outcome was fixed from the start.
And compares it to more recent evidence.
He draws a parallel to how some doctors questioning official COVID-19 policies were treated, and says he's now focused on filmmaking, not fighting to get his license back.
Okay, the conversation in the interview then pivots to the present day, mentioning Bobby Kennedy Jr.'s role.
Right. Now, Secretary of Health and Human Services, in this hypothetical scenario presented in the interview timeline.
And Wakefield seems to see this as a potential turning point.
He notes Kennedy's stated aim to base vaccine policy purely on science. He also brings up issues with V8 years, the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, claiming it only captures maybe 1% of actual adverse reactions, making it unreliable.
So what change does he hope Kennedy might bring?
He highlights Kennedy's reported commitment to doing proper placebo-controlled trials for childhood vaccines to really assess safety and efficacy. Wakefield claims this kind of rigorous testing has largely never been done for many vaccines on the schedule.
But isn't the argument always that placebo trials are unethical for vaccines? You can't withhold protection?
Wakefield dismisses that. He calls it a circular argument, basically saying you can't claim they're proven safe and effective enough to be essential if you haven't done the trials to prove it in the first place.
It's a complex ethical debate. Now, measles outbreaks are still a real concern. Our listener mentioned this too. How does Wakefield address vaccine effectiveness against measles?
It's interesting. He shows a graph supposedly of UK measles deaths, claiming a similar trend in the US. It shows mortality dropping dramatically before the measles vaccine was even introduced.
So he attributes that decline to other factors.
Yeah, things like better sanitation, nutrition, natural herd immunity developing over time.
Hmm.
He suggests the vaccine wasn't the sole driver of reduced mortality.
Does he raise concerns about the current vaccine's effectiveness?
He does. He talks about the possibility of new measles strains,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes called declades, emerging in heavily vaccinated populations, strains that the vaccine might not protect against as well.
And he makes a claim about outbreaks.
He mentions specific outbreaks, like one at Disneyland, claiming a substantial percentage of cases, maybe 43% in that instance, were actually caused by vaccine-related strains, not wild measles.
Vaccine strains causing measles.
That's his claim, and he alleges this information is suppressed. His overall point is the need for unbiased science and, crucially, fully informed consent for parents.
Let's touch on the hepatitis B vaccine for newborns. Our listener questioned this, and Wakefield seems to agree.
Absolutely. He finds the rationale for giving it to virtually all newborns questionable, given Hep B's typical transmission routes, IV drugs, sex, blood transfusions, things newborns aren't usually exposed to.
And safety concerns?
Big ones. He questions the lack of long-term safety data for vaccines given on day one of life. He alleges the pre-licensing studies for the newborn Hep B shot were incredibly short, like 5 days, lacked a proper placebo, and weren't even done on one-day-old infants.
So why the policy then, in his view?
He lays the blame squarely on Merck, the manufacturer. He claims they pushed for it to create a market after uptake was low among high-risk adults. Essentially, he says they didn't want to be stuck with an orphan drug.
And suggests advisory committees were influenced.
Yes, influenced by industry to recommend the policy, leading to widespread vaccination, without, in his view, genuinely informed consent, because even doctors weren't fully aware of these alleged background issues.
He also brings up thimerosal, the mercury preservative.
Right. Used historically in some vaccines, including multi-dose vials of Hep B for infants. He points out mercury's known toxicity and claims levels in some vaccines were way above EPA's safety limits for ingestion.
And connects this to autism cover-up allegations, too.
Yes, he references that alleged secret meeting at Simpsonwood, where he claims the CDC found a link between thimerosal-containing vaccines and neurological issues like autism, but then covered it up, partly by manipulating data in the published study.
Thimerosal has mostly been removed from childhood vaccines now, though.
It has. But Wakefield suggests that removal was more about managing public relations and reducing legal liability for the manufacturers, rather than a transparent admission of harm or a primary focus on child safety.
The interview also touches on the pressure doctors face regarding the vaccine schedule.
Yeah, he talks about how medical practices often push for strict adherence to the CDC schedule. Deviating can be difficult.
And potentially financial incentives involved.
He mentions bonuses for pediatricians hitting high vaccination rates in their practice. He sees this pressure coming from multiple angles: pharma influence, government agencies, maybe just ingrained beliefs, and definitely fear of professional backlash for questioning the status quo.
Towards the end, Knowles asks him directly, "What's your advice? What would you do?"
Wakefield is careful not to give specific medical advice. He insists people need to dig into the science themselves and make their own choices.
But he gives his personal opinion.
He does. He says, hypothetically, if he were a new father today, knowing what he believes he knows now, he wouldn't vaccinate his child at all.
At all. That's a strong statement.
Very. He bases it on his understanding of how infectious diseases have changed and his personal risk-benefit calculation. He even draws a parallel to the overuse of antibiotics leading to resistance.
The post-antibiotic apocalypse idea?
Right. Suggesting maybe messing with the immune system so intensely via vaccination could have unforeseen long-term downsides too.
Does he talk about where things might go from here with evolving viruses?
Briefly. He revisits the idea of measles strains becoming resistant in vaccinated populations, and he speculates that maybe mRNA vaccine technology, like we saw with COVID, could be pushed as a solution for failing traditional vaccines, which raises a whole new set of concerns for him.
And the issue of vaccine strain measles being hidden.
He reiterates his claim that those cases are happening, but being deliberately underreported or concealed by authorities.
So wrapping it all up, what's the core message Wakefield is trying to convey in this interview?
I think it boils down to two main things. First, a call for truly independent, unbiased science done with integrity to answer these critical public health questions about vaccines.
And second,
The absolute necessity of fully informed voluntary consent from parents. He argues that the current system, with its alleged pressures, coercion, and fear tactics, doesn't allow for that genuine consent.
Okay, so that's our deep dive into the Michael Knowles interview with Dr. Andy Wakefield. A really dense conversation covering a lot of controversial ground.
Definitely. Hopefully you listening feel like you have a much better grasp now of the specific arguments, the timeline, and the perspectives that Dr. Wakefield put forward in this particular source. It's clearly a topic that sparks intense debate.
It really does. And maybe a final thought for you to chew on after hearing all this. What does trusting the science actually mean when you encounter such conflicting narratives and serious allegations? What's the role of your own critical thinking in navigating this kind of complex health information?
Yeah, it's a tough question. It definitely underscores the importance of looking at information from multiple angles and engaging with these topics thoughtfully. We encourage you to keep exploring and evaluating for yourself.